type interfaces in TypeScript. In today's video, you're going to learn exactly what that is, how you can use optional properties on type interfaces, read-only properties, and then at the end, we're going to talk about some different things that we'll cover in future videos that are also important to know with type interfaces. So first off, what is a type interface? Well, a type interface is a way to declare a type for an object in TypeScript. It's kind of like the standard way that the TypeScript docs uses to create a type for their objects within their docs. So what is the syntax of a type interface? Well, it looks like this. So on line number 12 here, I create a type for a point object. And how you do this is you use the interface keyword. So this is a keyword in TypeScript in which it tells TypeScript, hey, I'm going to create a type interface here, or a type to represent an object. So use the interface keyword, and then following that, use the label for your type. So here, the custom type that I'm creating is called point. So this is going to represent an object, and I'm going to give it the type of point. All right. So instead of giving an object the type of number or the type of string, I'm going to create this interface and then give an object the annotation of type point. All right. And within this type interface here, you can see that I use no assignment operator. This is like the key syntactical difference that I always mix up between type interfaces and type aliases. With the type alias, you would use the assignment operator here to do equal sign and then your type, but with an interface, you don't. You just have the label here, and then following the label without a assignment operator, the equal sign, you open up a pair of curly braces, and then you specify the properties of your object that you want to represent with that interface. So here, I want to represent two different properties, X and Y, and then I give them both a type. So X is going to be a number, Y is going to be a number. So I'm creating a custom type here, or an interface to represent an object, and I give the label of point, and it's going to have the properties of X and Y, and those are both going to be numbers. And the way that I can use this in my program here is, say I have a function called print coord for print coordinate. It takes one argument here, and I give this argument the type annotation of point. So I'm saying I'm going to pass it an object that is going to have all the properties and values of my interface here that is of type point. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to count a log point.x and point.y, because I know that if I pass it a point type, it's going to have the properties of X and Y, and those are going to be numbers. But if I tried to console.log like point.z, well, I'm going to get an error because it knows that on my point type here, I don't have a property of z. All right, so it's going to enforce these types just like it would for any other type. All right, so that is kind of the basic syntax of an interface within TypeScript. Now, let's cover a couple of different cool things that you can do with interfaces. And this is by no means going to be all the things you can do with interfaces. This is going to be more of kind of the fundamentals of interfaces. And then in future videos, I'll have individual videos to cover more complex things with interfaces. But one thing that you can do is you can add optional properties to interfaces. So if you have a property on an object in which sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, you might not necessarily need a value on that property. Well, you can use the question mark operator. And this basically tells TypeScript that, hey, this value here is either going to be of type number or it's going to be undefined. All right. So when you define your interface and you have a property, you can put a question mark right after that property before your colon, and that's going to tell TypeScript that this is going to be of type, whatever type you have, and then or undefined. And as you can see in this like code hint right here, it gives me that paint options.exposition is going to be number or undefined. All right. So giving it this question mark right here is almost the same thing as just doing this right here and saying it's going to be number or undefined. But this is kind of like the shorthand way of doing that. The way that this can be used is I have a function called paint shapes. It takes my paint options interface object as one argument here. And then when I call this function, you can see that I can call it with just my X position here because my Y position is optional. I can call it with just my Y position because my X position is optional. And then I can call it with both my X and Y position as they are both valid on this object. But if I try to do like Z position like this, I'm going to get an error because it doesn't exist on my paint options type. And then also, you're going to see that if I remove this question mark right here on my Y position, you can see that when I first call this function with my options here, since I only call it with the X position, I get an error because this is now a mandatory field on this object, and it's going to enforce that I must have it on it. But when I add the question mark here, it can be a number here or undefined. All right. Now you can also use read-only properties with interfaces. And the way that this looks is instead of using like the question mark after the property name, you can actually use the read-only keyword before the property name. So here I have an interface to describe an object, and it's labeled some type, and it's going to have one property. This property is going to be called prop. Not the most kind of unique naming convention there, but that is going to be a property on this object. And then to make this a read-only property, I can use the read-only keyword before the name of that property. And that makes it read-only. Now, one thing to remember here is that this doesn't necessarily make this property immutable. It just makes it so you can't reassign it. So it's similar to how const works in JavaScript. If you have an object here and you change some of the values within that object, that is totally fine. But if you try to reassign it to a totally different object, that is not allowed. So using this example here, I have a function called do something, and it takes an object that is of some type. And then here, as you can see, I can read this property or I can access this property when I use this console.log statement and I do object.prop. But if I try to reassign this prop to a different value, TypeScript's going to yell at me and it's going to say, hey, you cannot assign to prop because it is a read-only property, as this can be a way to kind of protect this property a little bit from having values that you don't expect. All right. Now, there's a lot of other things you can do with interfaces like index signatures, extending interfaces, and then having different intersection types with interfaces, but I'll cover those all in future videos. All right. So if you haven't seen my video on type aliases, I think this is very complementary to this one. So you can click that here on the screen right now. But if you've already seen that, there's a chance that these videos are already out. I would recommend going to those next, and I'll see you in that next one.